The apartment felt different tonight. Janice couldn't quite put her finger on it, but something in the air had shifted. Maybe it was the silence that had grown teeth. Or maybe it was just her instincts finally breaking through the denial she'd wrapped around herself like armor. She stood in the doorway of the living room, watching Charles scroll through his phone on the couch, his face illuminated by the cold blue glow of the screen. His expression was blank, almost peaceful, as if she wasn't even there. For months. That's how long it had been since he'd really looked at her. For months since he kissed her with anything resembling desire. For months of living like polite roommates who happened to share a bed. Their relationship reduced to, "How was your day?" and careful choreography to avoid being in the same room too long. "Charles," she said softly, her voice barely cutting through the silence. He didn't look up, didn't pause his scrolling. It was as if she'd become invisible in her own home. "Charles, please." Her voice cracked this time, the weight of the loneliness pressing down on her chest like a stone. "Can we talk?" Finally, he lifted his eyes from the screen. The look on his face made her stomach drop. It wasn't anger she saw there, or even sadness. It was something far worse. Indifference, like she was nothing more than an inconvenience he'd learned to tolerate. "What do you want to talk about, Janice?" His tone was measured. Detached even, as if he were speaking to a stranger rather than the woman he'd built 7 years of life with. "About us," she said, moving closer, her hands trembling slightly. "About why you've been so distant. Why you don't touch me anymore. Why you barely look at me. I feel like I'm losing you and I don't understand why." A bitter smile played at the corners of his mouth and, for a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Something dark. "You don't understand why?" "No, I don't." The words burst out of her, desperate and raw. "One day everything was fine, and then suddenly you just disappeared. You're here, but you're not here. And I need to know what I did wrong so I can fix this. Please, Charles. Just tell me what I did." He set his phone down on the cushion beside him with deliberate care. Then he looked at her, really looked at her, and the coldness in his gaze made her blood run cold. "You didn't do anything wrong, Janice," he said quietly, almost kindly. "That's not why this is happening." Her heart lurched. "Then what? What is it?" He stood up slowly, and the physical distance between them felt like a chasm. When he spoke again, his voice was calm, clinical, devoid of emotion. "Are you sure you want to have this conversation tonight?" "Yes," she whispered, even though every instinct screamed at her to run. "I need to know." Charles nodded once, as if she'd just confirmed something he'd been waiting for. Then he said the words that would shatter her entire world. "I've been seeing someone else. For over a year now." The lies had a rhythm to them. Janice learned to recognize it in the way Charles would pause before answering simple questions, the way his eyes would drift left when he told her about his day, the way he'd started keeping his phone face down on every surface like it was a natural reflex. For months ago, something had broken. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a hairline fracture that spread through their life together like ice cracking across a frozen lake. She'd wake up and find him already gone, a cold coffee mug in the sink the only evidence he'd been home at all. He'd come back late, smelling like expensive cologne she'd never bought him, and slip into bed with the mechanical precision of someone completing a checklist. They still had dinner together on Thursdays. Still watched movies on the couch, though he always sat at the opposite end now, his body angled away from her. Still said, "I love you," before hanging up the phone, but the words had become muscle memory, sounds without substance. To anyone looking in from the outside, they were fine. Normal. Just another couple navigating the comfortable monotony of long-term love. But Janice knew better. She'd started documenting the absences in her mind like evidence for a trial she didn't want to attend. The way he'd changed all his passwords sometime in March. The new gym membership he suddenly needed, though he never came home with the tired satisfaction of someone who'd actually worked out. The business trips that multiplied, the late meetings that stretched into midnight, the friends she'd never met who kept demanding his time. She'd become a detective in her own relationship, reading receipts like tea leaves, analyzing text message timestamps, listening for the subtle shift in his voice when he talked about his day. And every investigation led her to the same terrifying conclusion. The man sharing her space wasn't really there anymore. He was a performance, a hologram, a carefully maintained illusion of partnership. The apartment had become a museum of their shared history. Photos on the walls from happier times, his favorite coffee mug still in the cupboard, their names still on the lease. But museums are for dead things, preserved and untouchable. And that's what they'd become. Two strangers curating the remains of something that used to be alive. She told herself stories to make it bearable. Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was a phase. Maybe if she just tried harder, loved him more perfectly, became smaller and quieter and less demanding, he'd come back to her. So she stopped asking questions. Stopped reaching for him in bed. Stopped expecting anything at all. But tonight, standing in that doorway at 2 a.m, watching him bathed in the blue light of secrets she couldn't see, Janice realized something that made her hands shake and her heart crack wide open. She'd been living in the architecture of absence for so long that she'd almost forgotten what presence felt like. And she couldn't do it anymore. The word hung in the air between them like smoke. Affair. Janice had said it, but hearing Charles confirm it with that single, devastating yes made her legs go weak. She gripped the door frame to steady herself, her mind racing to catch up with the reality that had just tilted sideways. Her name is Miranda, Charles said, and the casualness in his voice was worse than any apology could have been. He wasn't confessing. He was reporting facts, like he was updating her on the weather or discussing quarterly earnings. Janice felt something inside her chest crack. Miranda, she repeated, the name foreign in her mouth. A real person. Not an abstract concept, not a paranoid fantasy. A woman with a name. We met at the tech conference in Boston. The one I went to in November 2 years ago. He said it like he was reading from a script he'd rehearsed. Like he'd been waiting for this moment and had prepared his talking points. It started as just conversation. Then drinks. Then. He trailed off, but the implication hung heavy in the silence. 14 months, he continued, and Janice realized he was giving her a timeline without her even asking. Give or take a few weeks. I wasn't keeping exact track in the beginning. 14 months. Janice did the math in her head, counting backward through holidays and anniversaries and ordinary Tuesday nights when she'd kissed him goodnight, completely oblivious. Last Christmas, he'd been with someone else. Her birthday in March, someone else. The weekend they'd driven to her mother's funeral and he'd held her while she cried. He'd already been living a double life. I have an apartment, Charles said, and this detail somehow hurt more than all the others. An apartment meant planning. Meant furniture and lease agreements and a key he carried that she'd never seen. It's across town. Near the office. It made things easier. Easier. The word made her stomach turn. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to make him hurt the way she was hurting. But her body wouldn't cooperate. She just stood there, shivering in her oversized t-shirt, while he systematically dismantled 7 years of her life. How long were you planning to keep this going? Her voice sounded strange, distant, like it belonged to someone else. Charles looked at her then, really looked at her, and something almost like pity crossed his face. Honestly? I don't know. I hadn't thought that far ahead. He hadn't thought that far ahead. He'd rented an apartment, built an entire second life, spent 14 months lying to her face, but he hadn't thought about the endgame. The revelation was so absurd, so casually cruel, that Janice felt a laugh bubble up in her throat, hysterical and sharp. This was who she'd trusted with everything. This was who she'd believed in. This stranger standing in her living room, explaining his betrayal like it was a business transaction. The clock on the wall read 4:37 a.m. They'd been sitting in the wreckage of their relationship for over 2 hours, and Janice, still couldn't process how her entire life had become a lie while she slept beside him every night, completely unaware. Charles had moved to the kitchen, pouring himself water with steady hands while hers still trembled. The normalcy of the gesture made her want to scream. How could he be so calm? How could he stand there drinking water like he hadn't just detonated their entire existence? Why? The question came out hoarse, broken. If you've been with her for 14 months, why are you still here? Why didn't you just leave? Charles set the glass down carefully on the counter, and something in that precise, measured movement told Janice she wasn't going to like the answer. It was easier, he said simply. The words didn't make sense at first. Janice stared at him, waiting for more, waiting for the rest of the sentence that would make this comprehensible. But Charles just looked at her with that same flat indifference, like he'd already explained enough. Easier than what? She whispered. Then finding a new place. Then splitting everything up. Then having this conversation. He gestured vaguely at the space between them. You handled everything, Janice. The bills, the groceries, the scheduling. I didn't have to think about any of it. Coming home to you was comfortable. Predictable. The room tilted. Janice gripped the back of a chair, her knuckles white against the wood. Comfortable, she repeated, the word tasting like poison. I was comfortable. You're twisting what I said. No. Her voice was rising now, months of silence breaking apart. No, I'm hearing exactly what you said. You kept me around because I was convenient. Because I paid half the rent and made sure there was food in the fridge and didn't ask too many questions when you came home smelling like someone else. Charles sighed, and the sound of his exhaustion, his impatience with her pain, was what finally broke something fundamental inside her. I didn't have to try with you, he said, and the honesty in his voice was more brutal than any lie. Everything was already set up. Already running. Why would I disrupt that before I was ready? Before he was ready. As if her life, her heart, her sanity were factors to be considered only when convenient for his timeline. As if she'd been nothing more than a placeholder, a bookmark holding his spot while he figured out where he actually wanted to be. Janice looked at the man she'd loved for 7 years, the man she'd trusted with every vulnerable part of herself, and saw clearly for the first time what she'd really been to him. Not a partner. Not even a person. Just infrastructure. Just background noise. Just the path of least resistance until something better came along. Dawn was breaking outside the window, pale gray light filtering through the blinds, and Janice felt like she'd aged a decade in a single night. She'd moved to the couch at some point, her body heavy with exhaustion and shock, while Charles remained standing, that infuriating composure never cracking. You don't believe me, he said, and it wasn't a question. He pulled his phone from his pocket, unlocking it with a quick swipe. Here. Since you're going to ask anyway. Janice hadn't been going to ask. Some part of her desperately wanted to remain in the realm of abstract confession, where the affair was just words, not evidence. But Charles was already sitting beside her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, and holding the screen toward her like an offering. The first photo made her breath catch. Charles and a woman with long dark hair, sitting at a restaurant table. His arm was around her shoulders, his smile genuine in a way Janice hadn't seen directed at her in months. Maybe years. The woman was laughing, leaning into him with an ease that spoke of intimacy, of inside jokes and shared history. That was 3 weeks ago, Charles said, scrolling to the next photo. Her birthday dinner. Another image. The same woman, this time in what looked like a living room. His living room, Janice realized with a jolt. The apartment he'd rented. The one she'd never seen. Miranda was wearing his shirt, just a shirt, curled up on a couch that Janice had probably helped pay for without knowing it. He kept scrolling, methodical and efficient, showing her the architecture of his deception. Text messages that said, "Miss you already and can't wait to see you tonight." Receipts from restaurants she recognized, places he'd told her were business dinners or client meetings. Antonio's, where they'd celebrated their 3rd anniversary. The wine bar downtown where he'd taken her on their first date. He'd recycled their memories, fed them to someone else. "Stop," Janice whispered, but Charles kept going. "You wanted to know why," he said, pulling up a photo of Miranda asleep, sunlight streaming across her face. The intimacy of it, the tenderness in the framing, made Janice's stomach turn. "This is why. This is what I chose." The cruelty wasn't in the evidence itself. It was in how casually he presented it, scrolling through his betrayal like a vacation slideshow. Each swipe of his thumb revealed another moment she hadn't been part of, another piece of his life that had nothing to do with her. He wasn't showing her the photos to hurt her, though they did. He was showing her because he wanted her to understand that all of this with Miranda, was real. And what they'd had, what Janice had believed in for 7 years, had been the illusion all along. Charles finally locked his phone and set it on the coffee table between them. "Any other questions?" he asked, as if he'd just finished a presentation. By the time the sun had fully risen, Charles was in the bedroom packing. Janice sat frozen on the couch, listening to the sounds of drawers opening and closing, hangers scraping across the closet rod, the zip of a duffel bag. Each sound was a small violence, another piece of her life being systematically dismantled. When he emerged 20 minutes later, he carried only a single black duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Nothing else. No boxes, no suitcases, no armfuls of belongings. Just one bag, as if 7 years could be condensed into something you could carry to the gym. That's when Janice noticed the gaps in the bookshelf where his favorite novels used to be. The empty space on the dresser where his watch case had always sat. The missing photo frame from the hallway, the one with his parents. She stood up slowly, walked to the closet, and opened it with trembling hands. Half empty. His suits were gone. His good shoes. The leather jacket she'd saved up to buy him for his birthday 2 years ago. "How long?" Her voice was barely audible. "How long have you been moving things out?" Charles adjusted the bag on his shoulder, not quite meeting her eyes. "A few weeks. Maybe a month. I took a little bit each time so you wouldn't notice." A month. He'd been erasing himself from their life one piece at a time while she'd convinced herself everything would be okay. While she'd made him coffee in the mornings and asked about his day and tried so hard to bridge the distance between them. "The lease is in your name," he said, pulling his keys from his pocket. He worked his house key off the ring with practiced efficiency, like he'd rehearsed this moment. "The utilities, too. I moved my name off everything last month." Last month. While she'd been planning a weekend trip they'd never take. While she'd been researching couples therapists she'd never get to suggest. "The furniture is yours. Most of it was here before I moved in anyway." He set the key on the entry table with a soft click that sounded deafening in the silence. "I'll send money for my half of this month's rent. After that, it's all you." Janice stared at him, this stranger wearing her boyfriend's face, and tried to find something to say that would make him understand what he was doing. But there were no words big enough for this kind of destruction. "That's it," she finally managed. "You just walk away? Like none of this meant anything." Charles looked at her then, and for just a second, something flickered across his face. Regret, maybe. Or just discomfort at being the villain in someone else's story. "I'm sorry it ended this way," he said, and the generic platitude of it, the sheer inadequacy, made her laugh. A broken, bitter sound that hurt coming out. He walked to the door, and Janice watched him leave, taking nothing but that single bag and leaving her with everything else. The lease, the bills, the furniture they'd chosen together, the memories embedded in every corner of these walls. And a void shaped exactly like 7 years. The first 3 days, Janice didn't leave the bed. She called in sick to work with a voice so hollow her manager didn't ask questions, just told her to take the time she needed. She lay there in sheets that still smelled like Charles's shampoo, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the past 14 months like evidence at a crime scene. How had she missed it? The signs felt so obvious now, glaring and undeniable. Every late night, every changed password, every time he'd flinched when she touched him. She'd been living in a house on fire, convinced it was just getting warmer. By day 5, she'd moved to the couch but couldn't remember making the decision to do so. Time had become elastic, meaningless. She'd scroll through old photos on her phone, examining his face in each one, searching for the moment the lie had started. Was he thinking about Miranda when they'd gone to the beach last summer? When he'd said, "I love you" on New Year's Eve? When he'd held her after her mother's funeral? The apartment became a trap of memories. She couldn't walk into the kitchen without seeing him making coffee. Couldn't look at the couch without remembering movie nights that had apparently meant nothing. She stopped eating properly, living on crackers and whatever she could reach without having to think too hard. The crying came in waves. Sometimes she'd be fine, numb and floating through the hours, and then something would hit her. A song, a smell, the realization that she'd never again feel his arms around her. And she'd collapse wherever she was, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe, her chest heaving with the kind of grief that felt physically destructive. By the second week, she'd stopped showering, stopped answering her phone, stopped pretending she was going to be okay. The walls of the apartment pressed in on her, and she couldn't tell anymore if she was angry at Charles or at herself for being so blind, so stupid, so completely disposable. The knock on the door came on day 13. Janice ignored it, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. But the knocking continued, insistent, followed by a voice she recognized. "Janice, I know you're in there. Open the door." Her sister. Janice closed her eyes, willing her to go away. "I'm coming in," Sarah announced. "I still have the spare key, remember? Don't make this weird." The door opened, and Janice heard her sister's sharp intake of breath. She knew what Sarah was seeing. The unwashed dishes piled in the sink. The empty takeout containers on the coffee table. The curtains drawn against the daylight. And in the middle of it all, Janice herself, unwashed and hollow-eyed, a ghost in her own life. "Oh, honey," Sarah whispered, and the kindness in her voice was what finally broke through the numbness. "I don't know how to exist anymore," Janice said, and started crying again. "I don't know who I am without him." Sarah sat beside her, pulling her close. "Then we'll figure it out. But not like this. Not alone." The therapist's office was smaller than Janice expected, with soft gray walls and a single window that looked out onto a tree-lined street. Dr. Patricia Chin sat across from her in a chair that didn't try too hard to be comfortable, holding a notebook but not writing in it yet, just waiting. "I don't know where to start," Janice said, and even those words felt like an admission of failure. "Start anywhere," Dr. Chin said simply. "There's no wrong place to begin." So Janice began with the end. The 2 a.m. confrontation, the confession, the evidence scrolled through on his phone like he was showing her vacation photos. She talked for the entire 50-minute session, barely pausing for breath, and when it was over, Dr. Chin gave her homework that felt impossibly simple and impossibly hard. "Write it down," she said. "Not for him. For you. Write down what you remember. What you felt. What you ignored." That night, Janice sat at the kitchen table with a blank notebook Sarah had bought her and stared at the empty page for 20 minutes. Then she wrote a single sentence. "I knew something was wrong in March, but I told myself I was being paranoid." The next night, she wrote more. About how Charles had changed his phone password and she'd convinced herself it was about work security. About the new cologne that appeared in February and how she'd complimented him on it, never asking where it came from. About the weekend he'd said he was going to a work retreat but came home with a tan line that suggested hours by a pool. The red flags filled pages. So many she felt sick reading them back. How had she explained away so much? How had she convinced herself that love meant not asking questions, not demanding answers, not trusting her own instincts? By the 3rd week of therapy, she was writing about older things. The way Charles had slowly isolated her from friends, always having a reason they should skip dinner parties or game nights. How he'd criticized her career ambitions until she'd made herself smaller, quieter, less demanding. The times she'd wanted to travel or try something new and he'd sighed like she was being difficult, until eventually she'd stopped suggesting anything at all. She wrote about boundaries she didn't even realize she'd lost. The way she'd started asking permission to spend money from her own paycheck. How she'd learned to read his moods and adjust herself accordingly, becoming whatever version of Janice would cause the least friction. The voice inside her that had whispered warnings, and how she'd learned to silence it, convinced that doubt was the enemy of love. Dr. Chin read some of the entries during their sessions, nodding slowly. "You're seeing it now," she said. "The pattern. This didn't start with Miranda." No, Janice realized with a clarity that hurt. It had started the moment she decided that keeping Charles was more important than keeping herself. She'd been disappearing long before he'd ever walked out the door. Janice almost didn't see them. She was meeting Sarah for lunch at a bistro downtown, her first time venturing back into places she used to frequent with Charles. 3 months of therapy had given her the courage to reclaim her city, to stop hiding in her apartment like a fugitive from her own life. She was walking to the table Sarah had snagged by the window when she spotted them in the corner booth. Charles and Miranda, sitting side by side rather than across from each other, the way couples do when they can't bear even a table's width of distance. His arm was draped across the back of her seat, and she was laughing at something on his phone, her hand resting on his knee with casual ownership. Janice's feet stopped moving. Her hand tightened around her purse strap, and for a moment, the world tilted sideways. 3 months of work, of writing and crying and slowly stitching herself back together, and here was the evidence that he'd moved on without a single backward glance. She waited for the pain to hit. The crushing weight of seeing him happy with someone else, the jealousy, the rage, the desperate wish that it was still her sitting in that booth. She braced herself for the grief to swallow her whole right there in the middle of the restaurant. But it didn't come. Instead, she felt nothing. A strange, hollow absence where the hurt should have been. She watched Charles lean in to kiss Miranda's temple, the same gesture he used to make with her, and waited for her chest to crack open. But she just stood there, observing them like they were strangers in a movie she'd stumbled into halfway through. "Janice?" Sarah's voice pulled her back. Her sister had appeared beside her, following her gaze to the corner booth. Oh no. Do you want to leave?" Janice looked at Charles one more time. He did look happy. Genuinely happy in a way she'd convinced herself he'd been with her. And watching him now, she realized something that Dr. Chen had been trying to tell her for weeks. His happiness had nothing to do with her. His choices, his lies, his betrayal, none of it had been about her worth or her failure. He was just a man who'd chosen convenience over integrity, who'd built his life on the path of least resistance. And she'd been collateral damage in a story that was always only about him. "No," Janice said quietly, turning toward their table. "I don't want to leave." She sat down across from Sarah, her back to Charles and Miranda, and picked up the menu. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was calm. She felt nothing, and that nothing felt like the opposite of the everything that had consumed her for months. "You okay?" Sarah asked, watching her carefully. Janice thought about it, really thought about it. "Yeah," she said, surprised to find it was true. "I think I actually am." The numbness wasn't emptiness. It was peace. It was the sound of chains falling away. It was progress. The coffee shop was loud with the comfortable chaos of weekend morning crowds, and Janice found herself smiling at the noise rather than retreating from it. 6 months ago, she would have chosen the quietest corner, made herself small, tried not to take up too much space. But today, she'd claimed a table right in the middle of everything, ordered a large cappuccino without apologizing for the complicated order, and waited. When Maya walked through the door, Janice almost didn't recognize her college roommate. 8 years was a long time, and Maya had cut her hair short, added a nose piercing, aged in the way people do when they've actually been living instead of just surviving. But her smile was the same, bright and immediate, and when she spotted Janice, she rushed over with arms already open. "Oh my God, look at you," Maya said, pulling back from the hug to study her. "You look different. Good different." Janice laughed, and the sound felt natural, unforced. Different is one word for it. They settled into the rhythm of old friends catching up, trading stories about jobs and cities and the mutual acquaintances they'd both lost touch with. Maya talked about her recent promotion, her boyfriend who was terrible at cooking but excellent at making her laugh, the trip to Portugal she was planning for the fall. "What about you?" Maya asked, wrapping both hands around her mug. "Last I heard from Sarah, you were going through something major." Janice could have deflected, could have summarized 7 years into a neat, digestible breakup story that wouldn't burden anyone with the messy details. The old Janice would have. But something had shifted in the past 6 months, something fundamental in how she moved through the world. "I was with someone who made me forget who I was," she said simply. "And then he left, and I had to figure out if there was anything left to find." Maya's expression softened. "And was there?" "Yeah," Janice said, surprised by how much she meant it. "There was. There is. I'm taking a pottery class on Thursdays. I know that sounds random, but I always wanted to try it and Charles thought it was silly, so I just never did. And now I'm terrible at it, but I love it." She'd also rejoined her old book club, started running again, taken a weekend trip to the mountains by herself without asking anyone's permission or feeling guilty for wanting solitude. Small things that added up to a person she was beginning to recognize in the mirror. "I'm thinking about going back to school," Janice continued, the words surprising even her. "Getting my master's. I put it off because it didn't fit into our timeline, but there's no timeline anymore. Just mine." Maya grinned. "I love this for you. Can we make this a regular thing? Coffee, catching up, you telling me about all the things you're doing." "I'd really like that," Janice said, and meant it. They made plans for 2 weeks from now, then a month after that. Maya hugged her goodbye on the sidewalk, and Janice stood there for a moment after she'd left, feeling the sun on her face and the weight of possibility in her chest. She wasn't the girl who'd trusted Charles with everything anymore. But she was becoming someone better. Someone who trusted herself. And that woman, Janice was discovering, was worth getting to know. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video. Share your thoughts in the comments, your story matters too. And don't forget to subscribe for more real love stories, heartbreak confessions, and second chances, because the next one might feel painfully familiar.